My name is Eliana Brooks. I was 27 when I learned that some people can smile for photographs while quietly trying to destroy another person's dignity. The moment still returns to me in fragments. White roses. Soft violin music. My sister Avery smoothing the front of her wedding dress with trembling hands. And then a voice cutting through the ceremony, like a sheet of cold glass. Trash belongs where it came from. For a second, nobody moved. The words had come from the groom's mother. Not whispered. Not accidental. Spoken clearly enough for guests in the first few rows to hear. I remember looking at Avery first. Not the woman who said it. Not the groom. Not even our parents. Just Avery. Her smile didn't disappear immediately. It lingered for a strange second, as though her mind hadn't caught up to what her ears had heard. Then I watched the realization settle across her face. Slowly. Painfully. Like a shadow moving over sunlight. The wedding coordinator froze. A server carrying champagne stopped mid-step. Even the violinist seemed uncertain whether to continue playing. Yet somehow the ceremony moved forward. That's what shocked me most. Life often does. The worst moments rarely arrive with dramatic music or screaming. Sometimes they arrive wrapped in silence. The groom's mother adjusted her pearl necklace and sat down as if nothing unusual had happened. Avery lowered her eyes. The ceremony continued. And every second felt wrong. I wanted to stand. I wanted to say something. But I kept seeing Avery's face. She looked less angry than heartbroken. As though the insult itself wasn't new. As though she'd heard versions of it for years. That realization disturbed me more than the comment itself. Because it suggested a history none of us fully understood. And within the next hour, pieces of that hidden history would begin surfacing in ways nobody expected. The reception began beneath warm amber lights strung across the ceiling of an old renovated ballroom. To everyone else, it probably looked beautiful. To me, it felt strangely hollow. Avery moved from table to table thanking guests, smiling when expected, posing for photographs, and accepting congratulations. She performed happiness so convincingly that most people never noticed the strain behind her eyes. But I noticed. I'd spent 27 years reading my sister's silences. Every few minutes, her fingers found the small silver bracelet on her wrist, a nervous habit she'd carried since childhood. When we were kids, she touched it before difficult conversations, before school presentations, before hospital visits, before heartbreak. Now she touched it constantly. I finally caught her alone near a hallway leading toward the outdoor garden. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. The question sounded ridiculous the moment it left my mouth. She gave a small laugh. The kind people use when the truth feels too dangerous. "I'll survive." Not "I'm okay." Not "don't worry." Just "I'll survive." Something tightened in my chest. Before I could say more, a voice interrupted us. The groom's mother, Marianne. Elegant posture. Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. Everything about her looked polished except her words. "There you are," she said to Avery. "Guests are waiting." The sentence sounded harmless. The tone didn't. Avery immediately straightened her posture. Apologized. And walked away. Apologized. At her own wedding. To the woman who had insulted her less than an hour earlier. I stood frozen, watching the exchange. That was when I began noticing something else. People around Marianne seemed careful. Measured. Almost cautious. Even her own husband avoided direct disagreement. The groom, Ethan, rarely met her eyes for more than a few seconds. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then my phone vibrated. A message. Unknown number. No greeting. No explanation. Just a photograph. My stomach dropped. It showed a stack of printed emails. One page was highlighted in yellow. Across the top I could clearly read Avery's name. And beneath it, a sentence that changed everything I thought I knew about this marriage. "Avoid discussing these conditions with the bride until after the ceremony." I stared at the screen. Read it twice. Then 3 times. A second message arrived seconds later. "Check the groom's family office. 2nd floor." Before they realized someone kept copies. Suddenly, the wedding no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like the beginning of a truth that had been carefully hidden. And somewhere upstairs, that truth was waiting. I spent the next 10 minutes pretending to be interested in centerpieces and small talk while my mind raced through possibilities. The anonymous message could have been a cruel joke, a misunderstanding, a mistake. Yet I couldn't ignore the image I'd seen, nor could I ignore the knot growing tighter in my stomach. Eventually, I slipped away from the reception and found the staircase leading to the second floor. The hallway above was quiet, almost unnaturally quiet compared to the laughter and music drifting up from below. At the end stood a partially open door marked Private Office. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. I knew entering would cross a line, but something inside me kept replaying Avery's face when Marianne had spoken those words. That look hadn't come from a single insult. It came from accumulated damage. Years of it. I pushed the door open. Inside, the office looked temporary, as if it had been assembled for wedding logistics. Laptops sat on a conference table beside folders, schedules, and guest lists. Nothing seemed unusual, until I noticed a thick binder. Avery's name was printed neatly across the front. My pulse quickened. I opened it. The first pages appeared harmless: venue contracts, catering notes, travel arrangements. Then the tone shifted. Pages of correspondence. Notes. Recommendations. Instructions. Not from Avery. About Avery. I stood frozen as I read. Comments about her background. Comments about her career. Comments about which family traditions should be reduced after marriage. One line had been underlined. Certain aspects of her family image should be minimized during future public events. Her family image. Us. The words felt strangely clinical, as though my sister were a branding problem instead of a human being. Then I found something even worse. A printed email chain. Several relatives from Ethan's side had objected months earlier. One aunt had written, "Avery deserves transparency." Another relative had called the discussions inappropriate. The responses that followed were carefully worded but unmistakable. Concerns were dismissed. Questions redirected. The truth buried beneath polite language. This wasn't one cruel comment made during a stressful day. It was a pattern, a system, a way of thinking. As I turned another page, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. I immediately closed the binder. Voices approached the door. One belonged to Marianne. The other belonged to Ethan. And from the tension in their conversation, it was clear they had just discovered that something important was no longer under their control. I stepped behind a partially open storage cabinet just as the office door swung wider. The space wasn't large, and my heart hammered so loudly I was certain they would hear it. Marianne entered first. Still composed. Still immaculate. But the calm mask I'd seen all day had begun to crack around the edges. "Who has access to these files?" she asked. Her voice remained controlled, yet something underneath it sounded anxious. Ethan exhaled heavily. "You're worried about the wrong thing." "I'm worried about all of it." A long silence followed, the kind that reveals more than words. Then Ethan spoke again. "She was supposed to learn gradually." She. Not Avery's name. Just she. As though my sister were a situation to manage. I felt anger rise inside me, but it wasn't explosive anger. It was disappointment. The deep kind. The kind that arrives when people finally show you exactly who they are. Marianne lowered herself into a chair. For the first time all day, she looked tired. Older. Less certain. "You don't understand what happens if this becomes public." Public. There it was again. Image. Reputation. Appearance. Everything seemed to revolve around how things looked rather than how they felt. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "What happens if she discovers we've been discussing her life for months without her?" Neither answered immediately, and that silence told me enough. Eventually Marianne said quietly, "I was trying to protect this family." Protect. Such a strange word. People often use it when they're really trying to control something. The conversation continued in fragments. Enough for me to understand the truth. Months before the wedding, Marianne had become obsessed with shaping how Avery would fit into their family's carefully cultivated image. She hadn't trusted Avery's independence, her career choices, her unwillingness to pretend. Instead of speaking honestly, She had organized private discussions, gathered opinions, and built plans around a woman she never truly tried to know. The insult at the ceremony hadn't been spontaneous. It had simply been the first crack in a wall she'd spent months constructing. Then Ethan said something that changed everything. Avery already suspects. The room fell silent. Mary Ann looked up sharply. What do you mean? Ethan stared at the floor. Because she found one of the emails weeks ago. I stopped breathing. Weeks ago? Avery had known. At least part of it. And suddenly I realized my sister wasn't as powerless in this story as everyone assumed. In fact, she might have been quietly preparing for this moment long before the wedding day ever arrived. The realization followed me downstairs like a shadow. Avery had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize that something was wrong. Enough to continue forward while carrying a truth nobody else could see. When I returned to the reception, the dance floor had filled with guests. Music drifted through the room, soft and nostalgic, while waiters moved between tables carrying desserts. From a distance, everything looked perfect. But now I understood how much effort had gone into maintaining that illusion. I found Avery standing alone near a wall of tall windows overlooking the garden. Night had settled outside. The glass reflected the ballroom lights, making it look as though two versions of her existed at once. The bride everyone could see, and the woman carrying unanswered questions. Before I could speak, she turned toward me. I know where you've been. I blinked. You do? A faint smile touched her face. You're terrible at pretending everything is normal. For the first time that day, I heard genuine warmth in her voice. I told her about the binder, the emails, the conversation upstairs. She listened quietly. No surprise. No shock. Just a tired understanding. When I finished, she looked down at the silver bracelet circling her wrist. I found an email 6 weeks ago, she admitted. The words came slowly, carefully. As soon as I read it, I knew there were probably others. I waited. Aren't you angry? I finally asked. She thought about the question longer than I expected. Yes, she said softly. But anger isn't the hardest part. What is? She stared through the window. The disappointment. I understood immediately. Because disappointment isn't about what happened. It's about what could have happened instead. The honesty that never came. The conversations that never happened. The respect that should have existed from the beginning. Avery reached into her small bridal handbag and removed a folded envelope. Its edges were worn from being opened repeatedly. I've been carrying this for weeks. What is it? A letter. She took a slow breath. Not for Ethan. Not for Mary Ann. Not for anyone specific. A letter she had written to herself. A record of everything she had discovered, questioned, and felt. Every doubt. Every contradiction. Every moment she considered walking away. I wasn't sure whether I'd ever use it, she admitted. The music swelled in the ballroom behind us. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. Life continued. Yet standing there beside the window, I sensed that my sister had already made a decision. I just didn't know what it was. Then she carefully folded the letter again and whispered something that made my pulse quicken. Tonight isn't about exposing anyone. She looked toward the crowded reception. It's about finally telling the truth. And somehow, those words seemed to frighten the groom's family far more than any accusation ever could. For the next half hour, Avery said very little. That alone made me nervous. Not because silence meant weakness. Because with my sister, silence usually meant she had already reached a conclusion. The reception continued around us, like a carefully choreographed performance. Guests shared stories, posed for photographs, and toasted the newlyweds. Yet beneath the celebration, I could feel a subtle shift moving through the room. A tension. A waiting. As though several people knew a conversation was coming and were quietly hoping to avoid it. Eventually, the master of ceremonies tapped a glass and announced an open microphone segment for family remarks. A simple tradition. Nothing unusual. But I saw Mary Ann stiffen immediately. I saw Ethan glance toward Avery. And I saw Avery reach into her handbag. The letter. The same letter she had carried for 6 weeks. My stomach tightened. She stood slowly. No dramatic movement. No scene. No attempt to command attention. Yet somehow the room grew quieter as she walked toward the microphone. The ballroom lights reflected softly against her wedding dress. For a moment, she looked exactly like the confident woman everyone believed they knew. Then she unfolded the letter. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From honesty. "I wasn't planning to give a speech tonight," she began.
Her voice was calm, steady, human.
"I thought weddings were supposed to be about promises." The room remained silent. No one interrupted. No one looked away. Avery glanced briefly toward Ethan before continuing. "Over the past several months, I've learned that promises mean very little without transparency." The air seemed to leave the room, not because her words were harsh, because they were true. She never mentioned insults, never named emails, never accused anyone. Instead, she spoke about trust, about what happens when people discuss someone's future without inviting them into the conversation, about how respect cannot exist in private if it only appears in public. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uneasy looks. Even Marianne remained completely still. Then Avery said something I will never forget. "The hardest betrayal isn't being disliked."
She paused.
"It's discovering that people made decisions about your life while smiling to your face." A silence settled over the ballroom unlike any silence I'd ever heard. Not hostile, reflective. And in that moment, the carefully protected image the groom's family had spent months defending began unraveling on its own, not through exposure, but through a simple truth spoken aloud for everyone to consider. After Avery finished speaking, she folded the letter with the same care she had shown when she first took it from her handbag. Then she stepped away from the microphone. No accusations, no names, no dramatic reveal, just truth. For several seconds, nobody moved. The silence felt different now, not tense, thoughtful, as though every person in the room had been handed the same question and was privately searching for an answer. What do we owe the people we claim to love? I looked toward Ethan. His eyes followed Avery as she returned to her seat. There was no anger on his face, only realization, the painful kind, the kind that arrives when excuses finally stop working. Across the room, Marianne sat motionless. For the first time all evening, she seemed less concerned with appearances than with consequences. Not public consequences, personal ones. The emotional cost of choices that could no longer be hidden behind polite language. A few guests quietly approached Avery, not to ask questions, not to gather gossip, simply to offer support. A hand on her shoulder, a gentle smile, a moment of understanding. It was remarkable. The truth had not divided the room. It had clarified it. Later that evening, Ethan asked Avery if they could speak privately in the garden. I stayed inside, watching through the tall windows. The night air moved softly through the trees. Strings of lights glowed above them like suspended stars. They talked for a long time. Sometimes Ethan spoke. Sometimes Avery did. Sometimes neither spoke at all. From where I stood, I couldn't hear a single word. Yet I understood something important. This conversation wasn't about winning. It wasn't about blame. It was about whether honesty could still exist after trust had been damaged. When they finally returned, both looked exhausted, but strangely lighter, as though a burden carried for months had finally been placed on the ground. The reception continued, quieter now, more genuine, less performative. And while many people assumed the wedding story had reached its conclusion, the most important chapter was still waiting. Because before the night ended, Marianne would make a choice of her own. One that nobody in the family expected. Here's the final section, written to deliver the quiet, reflective closure your framework calls for. Near the end of the evening, most of the guests had already left. The ballroom looked different now. Half-empty tables. Wilted flower petals scattered across white linens. Candles burning lower than before. The kind of scene that always follows major life moments. The evidence that something important has passed and can never be repeated exactly the same way again. I was helping gather a few personal items when I noticed Marianne approaching Avery. For a second, neither woman spoke. The distance between them wasn't large, yet it seemed filled with months of assumptions, misunderstandings, and unspoken judgments. Then Marianne did something I hadn't expected. She sat down, not as a family matriarch, not as someone protecting an image,
Just as a tired human being.
the conversation was quiet. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. No excuses. No attempts to rewrite history. No claims of misunderstanding. Only acknowledgement. She admitted she had spent so much time trying to control uncertainty that she had forgotten how to build trust. She admitted she had viewed Avery as someone who needed to fit into the family rather than someone worth understanding. Most importantly, she admitted that the damage had been real. Avery listened. She didn't immediately forgive. She didn't immediately reassure. Because some truths deserve space. And some wounds require honesty before healing. When they finally stood, nothing looked magically repaired. Life rarely works that way. But something had changed. The pretending was over. The masks were gone. The truth was finally standing in the open. Months later, I found myself thinking back to that wedding. Not to the insult. Not to the panic. Not even to the hidden emails. I remembered the letter. A few simple pages folded inside a handbag. Because in the end, that letter accomplished what anger never could. It gave the truth a voice. Today, Avery and I still talk about that night sometimes. We rarely discuss the betrayal itself. Instead, we talk about what came after. The conversations, the boundaries, the honesty that should have existed from the beginning. And whenever I remember the ballroom windows reflecting two versions of my sister, I realize something. Only one of them survived the night. The woman who spent years shrinking herself to fit other people's expectations quietly disappeared. The woman who remained chose dignity over silence, truth over performance, self-respect over approval. And beneath the fading wedding lights, that choice became the most beautiful part of the entire story. If this story touched you, remember, real strength isn't found in revenge. It's found in knowing your worth when others fail to see it. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't a fight. It's telling the truth and refusing to abandon yourself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a moment where quiet honesty changed everything? We'd love to hear your story.